The man behind the equations, Richard Feynman's most human moments. There's a photograph taken in 1954 at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In it, Richard Feynman is sitting across from Albert Einstein. Both men are laughing. Not polite, professional laughter. Real laughter. The kind that makes your eyes water and your shoulders shake. Nobody recorded what they were laughing about, and somehow that makes it more beautiful. Because in that moment, they weren't the two most consequential physicists of the 20th century. They were just two guys who found something funny. That image has stayed with people for decades, not because of what it represents scientifically, but because of what it reveals humanly. These were real people. Flawed, funny, grieving, curious, stubborn, tender people. And for all the physicists who ever lived, Richard Phillips Feynman may have been the most fully, completely, undeniably human. We tell the story of genius wrong. We turn scientists into statues. We chisel their equations into stone and forget the trembling hands that wrote them. We memorize their discoveries and forget the heartbreaks that surrounded them. We celebrate their intellect and forget their love. This is not that kind of story. This is the story of a man who cracked safes at Los Alamos to prove a point about security, who played bongo drums in a strip club in Las Vegas, who wrote love letters to a woman who had already died, who refused to lie even when the entire United States government was watching, who once told a room full of Nobel laureates that the key to science was being willing to admit you don't know. This is the story of Richard Feynman, not the equation, the man. And if you pay attention, really pay attention, what you'll find is that the man and the genius were never separate things. The curiosity that made him great at physics was the same curiosity that made him learn Portuguese just to read Brazilian literature in its original language. The honesty that made his scientific work trustworthy was the same honesty that made him infuriating to work with on committees. The joy he brought to understanding nature was the same joy he brought to life itself. He didn't compartmentalize. He couldn't. He was one thing, completely. Let's begin at the beginning. Part 1. The boy who took apart the world. Richard Feynman was born on May 11, 1918, in Queens, New York. His father, Melville Feynman, was a uniform salesman with an extraordinary mind and no formal education. His mother, Lucille, gave him his humor. Together they gave him something rarer than intelligence. They gave him permission to wonder. Before Richard could read, his father would take him for walks and show him birds. But Melville Feynman didn't just name birds. Any father can name a bird. He would point to a bird and say, "See that bird?" In English, it's called a brown-throated thrush. In Portuguese, it's called a pardal. In Chinese, long tien li. In Italian, la gassa ladra. Now you know all those names. But you know absolutely nothing about the bird. You only know something about people and what they call it in different places. Now let's look at the bird. Feynman told that story hundreds of times throughout his life, because it was the foundation of everything. His father had taught him the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something, and that distinction would become central to how Feynman thought about physics, about education, about almost everything. He spent his childhood taking things apart, radios mostly. Not because he wanted to break them, but because he needed to understand how they worked. When he was 12 years old, he set up a little lab in his room and started fixing radios for neighbors. He had no formal training. He just thought about what the problem might be, formed a hypothesis, and tested it. Pure Feynman even then. There's a story from those days that he loved to tell. A man brought him a broken radio, completely baffled by it. The radio would make a loud crackling noise when you first turned it on, then quiet down. Feynman took the radio, looked at it, and then just started walking around the room with it, holding it in different positions, tilting it, rotating it. The man was getting annoyed. What is this kid doing? Finally, Feynman said he thought he knew what was wrong, fixed it in a few minutes, and handed it back. The man was stunned. He told everyone he knew about the boy who fixed radios by thinking. That phrase stuck. By thinking, not by consulting a manual, not by following a checklist, by actually thinking about what might be happening inside the machine. That's how he would approach physics for the rest of his life. Part 2. Princeton and the Weight of Expectation. By the time Feynman arrived at Princeton for graduate school in 1939, he already had a reputation. MIT professors called him exceptional. His mathematical intuition was described as almost frightening. But what distinguished him wasn't just ability, it was attitude. Other students approached problems with appropriate deference. They treated unsolved questions with a certain reverence, like relics you shouldn't touch too carelessly. Feynman treated them like puzzles, like games, like invitations. His thesis advisor was John Archibald Wheeler, himself one of the great minds of the century. Wheeler had this expression he used: "If you're not confused, you haven't been thinking clearly." Feynman loved that. It confirmed something he already believed. Confusion isn't a sign of failure. Confusion is the starting point. It means you've found the edge of what you understand, and the edge is exactly where the interesting things live. One day in Princeton, something happened that Feynman talked about with a kind of gleeful disbelief for the rest of his life. He received an invitation, delivered with great solemnity, to have tea with Albert Einstein. Now, stop and think about this for a moment. You are 21 years old. You are a graduate student. You grew up in Queens. Your father sold uniforms. And you have just been invited to have tea with the man who upended our understanding of space, time, mass, and energy. The man whose name had already become a synonym for genius, Albert Einstein, in person. At 4 o'clock, Feynman's response, as he later described it, was something like, "Well, I guess I better go." That quality, that refusal to be paralyzed by awe, was not arrogance. It was something subtler and more interesting. It was a kind of democratic approach to intellectual authority. Feynman believed that ideas had to stand on their own merits, regardless of who expressed them. Einstein's name didn't make an idea right. The idea had to be right on its own. And if you approached every thinker, no matter how famous, looking at their ideas on those terms, then meeting Einstein was just meeting a person with interesting ideas, which is exactly what it was. He attended the tea. Einstein was kind, curious, genuinely interested in Feynman's work. They talked about physics. They disagreed about some things. Feynman held his positions, not aggressively, but honestly. He said what he thought. That was, in its quiet way, extraordinary. Part 3. Arlene, but here's the thing you need to understand about Richard Feynman before anything else. Before Los Alamos, before the Nobel Prize, before the Challenger investigation, before any of it, there was Arlene. Arlene Greenbaum was his first love, his high school sweetheart, the person he intended to spend his life with. She was artistic, spirited, beautiful, and deeply matched to him. She had this quality of seeing through pretension, of calling out the gap between what people said and what they meant, that complemented his own hunger for honesty. They were, by every account, exactly right for each other. In 1941, Arlene was diagnosed with tuberculosis. This was before penicillin could effectively treat it. It was, in that era, effectively a death sentence delivered in slow motion. The doctors were honest. She might have a few years. Feynman's family urged him to reconsider the marriage. Friends tried to reason with him. The logic seemed clear to everyone around him. Why bind yourself to someone who is dying? Why start a marriage that can only end in grief? Feynman's response was characteristically his own. He said that Arlene's illness didn't change who she was. It didn't change what they had. It didn't change the future they could still build together, even if that future was shorter than either of them had hoped. The question he was asking was not about years, it was about integrity. Did he love her? Yes. Did he want to be with her? Yes. Was there any logical argument that could change those fundamental facts? No. So the course of action was obvious. They were married on June 29, 1941, in a small civil ceremony at Staten Island City Hall. They arrived by bus. He couldn't kiss her because of the tuberculosis precautions. They rode the bus home. That was their wedding. And then came Los Alamos, and the world changed for everyone. Part 4. The Bomb and the Safecracker. In 1943, Feynman joined the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico. He was 25 years old. He would work alongside Niels Bohr, Hans Bethe, John von Neumann, Enrico Fermi, and dozens of other men who would later fill the pages of physics history books. He was the youngest significant figure in that constellation of talent. Los Alamos under J. Robert Oppenheimer was an extraordinary environment. extraordinary in its intellectual density, in its secrecy, in its urgency, and in the particular moral weight that pressed down on everyone there. These were people who understood, more than almost anyone else alive, what they were building. They understood the physics of what they were doing, and they worked anyway because they believed, or needed to believe, that the alternative was worse. Feynman engaged with that moral complexity in his own way, which was not always the way others engaged with it. He had a gift for staying inside the immediate problem when the larger questions became too heavy to hold. He focused on the work. He focused on the physics. He focused on the puzzles. And sometimes, when he needed relief from the weight of it all, he picked locks. Los Alamos was an intensely security-conscious environment. There were filing cabinets everywhere, locked filing cabinets containing classified documents. The security personnel were serious, disciplined, and proud of their systems. Feynman found this irresistible. He began studying lockpicking. He read manuals. He practiced on combination locks until he understood their mechanical logic. And then he started opening filing cabinets that weren't his. Not to steal anything, not to cause harm, to prove a point. Because he had noticed that the locks most people considered secure weren't actually secure at all if you thought about them carefully, if you understood how the mechanism worked rather than just accepting that it was supposed to keep things locked. He left notes in the cabinets, little jokes. I borrowed document number such and such, back by Tuesday. The security officers were not amused. Feynman was delighted. There's a deeper point here that he was making, even if he was making it with characteristic mischief. Security that relies on people not knowing how to defeat it isn't real security. Real security has to hold up against someone who genuinely understands the system. The fact that he could open those filing cabinets wasn't just funny. It was important information. The classified documents of the most sensitive military project in American history were protected by locks that a curious graduate student could defeat with an afternoon of focused study. He told the security officers this. They did not thank him. They did ask him to stop. He mostly did. Meanwhile, every weekend that circumstances permitted, he made the long trip to Albuquerque, where our line had been placed in a sanatorium. The distances at Los Alamos were enormous and transportation was difficult. He borrowed cars, bummed rides, hitchhiked. He was relentless about getting to her. They wrote each other constantly. The letters were censored, of course, which Feynman found immediately intolerable. He and our line developed an elaborate system of coded communication. Not because they were sharing secrets, but because the idea of military censors reading their private correspondence offended his sense of dignity. The censors were not amused. Feynman was, again, delighted. Arlene was often very ill, but she remained, by all accounts, herself. Sharp, funny, honest, unwilling to pretend she felt better than she did, but also unwilling to let the illness be the entire story of their time together. She sent him puzzles, she sent him jokes. She sent him, on one occasion, a jigsaw puzzle with the pieces still locked in a block of hardened wax, because she knew he would have to figure out how to get them free before he could even begin the puzzle. He loved it. On June 16, 1945, Arline Feynman died. She was 25 years old. Richard was 27. He sat with her. He noted with the part of his mind that never completely stopped observing that he didn't cry. He was puzzled by this. He thought perhaps he was in shock, or perhaps the grief was too large for that particular response. He kissed her forehead. He noted that the clock in the room had stopped at the moment of her death. And then he figured out why. The clock had a faulty mechanism that would stop when it was jostled or tilted. And the nurses who had come in when Arline died had probably disturbed the clock without realizing it. He worked through the physics of why the clock had stopped. That was how his mind worked, even then. Maybe especially then. He drove back to Los Alamos. 3 weeks later, on July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested at Trinity Site. Feynman watched through a windshield, reasoning that the glass would protect his eyes from the ultraviolet radiation. He was probably the only person at Trinity Site looking directly at the explosion with unshielded eyes, protected only by a glass windshield. Later, he said he thought it was beautiful. Then he went home and thought about what it meant. He sat with it for a while, then put it in the same place he had to put everything too large to carry, beside him, acknowledged, not resolved. And then, about a year later, in a hotel room in New York, the grief finally came for him. He saw a dress in a shop window that Arlene would have loved. He stopped walking, and then he couldn't stop crying. He was deeply suspicious of delayed grief. He talked about this later. He thought it said something important about the human mind's protective mechanisms, about the way we sometimes cannot fully process an experience until we are in a safe enough place to feel it. He found this fascinating and devastating in equal measure. Part 5. The letters after Arlene died. Feynman wrote her a letter. This is not a metaphor. This is literal. He sat down, took paper, and wrote a letter addressed to her, knowing she would never read it, unable not to write it anyway. The letter was found after his death in 1988. It had been sealed in an envelope for 43 years. Inside was a piece of paper with his handwriting. The letter began, "Darlene, I adore you, sweetheart." He wrote about how he still found himself thinking about things he wanted to tell her. He wrote about seeing something and wanting to share it with her, then remembering. He wrote about the ordinary moments of grief. The ones nobody warns you about, not the large ceremonial pain of funerals and anniversaries, but the small ambushes. The moment you start a sentence that would have been meant for her, the habit of love that continues after its object is gone. He told her that he knew she would know how much he loved her. He said there were so many things he had been unable to say while she was alive, not because he didn't feel them, but because he wasn't very good at saying them. He was, he admitted, better at physics than at expressing emotion. That made him like most people. That made him human. At the end of the letter, he wrote a postscript. It said, "Please excuse my not mailing this, but I don't know your new address." There is no academic framework for that sentence. No physics equation that contains it. It exists only in the dimension of love and loss, which are, it turns out, the most real dimensions we have, the most irreducible, the ones that exist regardless of whether we understand them. He never remarried quickly. He dated, he was social, he was never someone who withdrew from life. But he carried Arlene with him, quietly, for the rest of his life. When he eventually did remarry, he chose Gwyneth Howarth, a woman who matched his vitality and his love of life, and they had a genuinely happy marriage. He had a daughter, Michelle, and adopted a son, Carl. By all accounts, he was a devoted, playful, deeply engaged father, but Arlene was always there. In the sealed letter, in the dress in the shop window, in the way he talked about love, those rare times when he talked about it at all, with a gravity that surprised people who thought they knew him only as the clever, irreverent, bongo-playing professor. Part 6. John von Neumann and the Art of Irresponsibility. Let me tell you about one of the most clarifying conversations Richard Feynman ever had. John von Neumann was, by most measures, one of the most formidable intellects of the 20th century. His contributions spanned mathematics, quantum mechanics, game theory, and computer science. He was, by all accounts, terrifyingly capable. And he liked Feynman enormously. One afternoon at Los Alamos, von Neumann said something to Feynman that Feynman later described as one of the most liberating things anyone had ever told him. Von Neumann said, "You don't have to be responsible for the world you're in." He meant this specifically in the context of the moral weight of Los Alamos, in the context of working on a weapon with unprecedented destructive capacity. But Feynman, in the way that good ideas travel, applied it more broadly. He interpreted it to mean that he didn't have to carry the entire burden of every consequence of his curiosity. He could think about physics without first solving the problem of how physics would be used. He could be curious without first resolving every ethical implication of the thing he was curious about. He could be himself, completely, without requiring himself to also be a saint or a philosopher or a guardian of all possible applications of knowledge. This, Feynman said, was a permission slip to be irresponsible in the best possible sense, to follow curiosity without constantly interrogating its justification, to wonder freely, to pursue questions because they were interesting, not because they were guaranteed to produce good outcomes. He never used this as an excuse for actual irresponsibility. He was, in practice, quite deeply ethical, but the psychological permission to not carry all possible consequences at all times freed something in him. It allowed him to be playful with ideas at a scale that more burdened thinkers couldn't manage. There's something in this worth sitting with. We often talk about responsibility as if it means carrying everything, but there's a version of that position that becomes paralysis. You cannot think clearly about physics if every thought requires you to first trace all possible ethical ramifications. At some point, you have to trust the process of thinking itself and deal with consequences as they become clear. Von Neumann gave Feynman permission to trust that process, and Feynman ran with it for the next 40 years. Part 7. The Genius of Not Knowing After the War. Feynman went to Cornell, then to Caltech, where he would spend the rest of his career. And he did something that many people around him found strange. He went through a period where he felt like he couldn't do anything. The Manhattan Project had been, in some ways, a creative high that left him temporarily exhausted. The problems were too big or too small, or not interesting enough, or already solved. He felt stuck, and he started to believe, quietly, that maybe his best work was behind him. He sat in a university cafeteria one afternoon and watched someone toss a plate in the air. The plate wobbled. He could see that the wobble rate and the spin rate were related in some specific ratio. He tried to work out why. He had absolutely no idea what this was good for. He didn't care. He just thought it was interesting. He worked out the physics of the wobbling plate. Then he found that this connected to equations he recognized from other contexts. Then those equations turned out to be related to fundamental questions in quantum electrodynamics. And suddenly he was working again, really working. The way he worked when he was a kid taking apart radios, not because he was supposed to, because he couldn't help it. The work that emerged from that period would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, shared with Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tomonaga. The wobbling plate was the beginning. When he accepted the Nobel Prize, Feynman gave a speech that was, characteristically, not what anyone expected. He didn't bask in the recognition. He expressed some ambivalence about prizes in general, because prizes suggested that the reward for doing physics was external recognition when the actual reward was the doing of physics. He was grateful, but careful. He didn't want anyone, including himself, to get confused about what the prize was for. He later said that the Nobel itself was less pleasurable than the moment of discovery, which is either the most honest thing a Nobel laureate has ever said, or the most arrogant, depending on how you read it. I think it's the most honest. Part 8. Teaching as performance art. In 1961, Feynman was asked to redesign the introductory physics curriculum at Caltech. The result was the Feynman Lectures on Physics, which remain, more than 60 years later, arguably the greatest work of physics pedagogy ever produced. The Feynman Lectures are not easy reading. He never dumbed anything down. But they have a quality that almost no other physics textbook shares. They make you feel like physics is something you personally can understand if you're willing to think hard enough. He never puts himself above you. He never positions himself as the keeper of knowledge, graciously distributing it to the ignorant. He positions himself as someone who is working through these ideas with you, in real time, with genuine excitement about what he's finding. He used to say that if you can't explain something simply, you don't really understand it yet. This is often quoted as a compliment about simplicity, but it's actually a more demanding statement than it appears. It means that understanding is not just having the equations. Understanding means being able to translate the equations into something a non-expert can follow. If you can't do that, your understanding is incomplete, no matter how fluent you are with the mathematics. He tested himself against this standard constantly. He would take complicated ideas like quantum electrodynamics, which won him his Nobel Prize, and ask himself whether he could explain the core of it to a curious non-physicist. If he couldn't, he kept working on his understanding until he could. His lectures were performances. He arrived without notes or with minimal notes and taught for an hour with the focused, roaming energy of someone genuinely thinking aloud. Students who were there described the experience of watching him suddenly stop mid-sentence, stare at nothing, and then say something like, "Wait, no, actually, here's a better way to see it," and then pivot completely and explain the same idea from an angle nobody had tried before, and it would be clearer than anything that had come before. He was not always kind in his assessments of other people's explanations. He found bad pedagogy offensive. Not bad pedagogy that confused advanced students, but bad pedagogy that unnecessarily confused ordinary curious people who would have understood if it had been explained properly. He believed very strongly that science belonged to everyone who was willing to engage with it, and that unnecessarily technical or jargon-heavy presentation was a kind of theft. You were stealing understanding from people who deserved it. Part 9. Curiosity without borders. People tend to assume that Feynman's intellectual life was primarily about physics. This is like saying Mozart's life was primarily about the piano. Technically accurate, fundamentally misleading. Feynman was obsessively curious about everything. Not everything in the way people sometimes mean when they describe someone as generally interested in the world. He pursued other subjects with the same focused intensity that he brought to physics. He learned to draw, not as a hobby, not casually, but with genuine discipline. He studied with a professional artist named Gerard Zorthian, who became a close friend. They had a wager. Feynman would try to teach Zorthian enough physics to appreciate its beauty, and Zorthian would try to teach Feynman to draw. Both men claimed the other one won the bet. Feynman eventually showed his artwork under a pseudonym, selling pieces through galleries without anyone knowing who made them. He wanted the work to be judged on its own merits, not filtered through the fame of the physicist. He learned to play bongo drums and frigideira, a Brazilian percussion instrument, with enough skill to play professionally. He spent time in Brazil on a teaching assignment and fell completely in love with the culture, the music, the people. He participated in carnival bands, he took lessons from real musicians and practiced with genuine seriousness. He was not performing an interest in Brazilian culture. He was actually interested. He spent time in Las Vegas playing drums in a strip club band, which he found genuinely enjoyable and which drove certain colleagues absolutely crazy. He thought their discomfort was interesting. Why should a physicist be confined to certain kinds of social environments? What rule was he violating? He found the implicit rules of academic respectability slightly absurd. He learned about biology. He spent a significant period of time working with a biology laboratory, not doing his own research exactly, but trying to understand how biologists thought, what their methods were, how they approached problems differently than physicists did. He was honest about what he didn't understand and refused to pretend that his expertise in physics gave him automatic credibility in other fields. He became fascinated with the Mayan codices, those ancient manuscripts written in a language that scholars had only partially decoded. He taught himself enough about the encoding system to independently verify certain interpretations and challenge others. When he presented his conclusions to experts in the field, some of them were surprised to discover that an amateur had gotten there independently. He explored Tuva, a small republic in southern Siberia, with his friend Ralph Layton, for reasons that started as a kind of joke about an unusual stamp collection and became a genuine obsession. He applied for a visa to visit Tuva for years. The Soviet bureaucracy and then the post-Soviet bureaucracy delayed him repeatedly. He never made it to Tuva. He died before the visa came through. But the attempt itself was pure Feynman, a curiosity that started from nowhere in particular and was pursued with absolute seriousness because the pursuit was its own reward. Part 10. Honesty as a form of love. The story that perhaps best illustrates Feynman's relationship with honesty comes from a commencement address he gave at Caltech in 1974. It has become one of the most quoted scientific speeches ever given, and it deserves every bit of attention it gets. He talked about what he called cargo cult science. During World War II, certain Pacific Island populations had encountered the extraordinary material abundance of American military operations. Airplanes landed, goods poured out, and then the military left. After the war, some island communities created imitations of the infrastructure they had observed. Landing strips cleared from jungle, wooden airplanes on the strips, figures in the costumes of air traffic controllers, all of it recreated in elaborate detail. They were performing the form of the process without understanding its causal mechanism. They expected planes to land. The planes didn't come. Feynman said that a lot of what passes for science has exactly this character. People learn the appearance of scientific method, the terminology, the format of papers, the gestures of rigor, without internalizing the essential thing that makes science actually work. And the essential thing, he said, is this: you must not fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. The scientific method, at its core, is a system for protecting us from our own biases. We want our theories to be true. We design experiments and, unconsciously or consciously, we shade the design in favor of outcomes we prefer. We ignore results that don't fit. We emphasize results that do. We're not being dishonest exactly. We're being human. But science requires something more than ordinary human honesty. It requires active, disciplined self-suspicion. Feynman believed this with his whole being. He held himself to this standard relentlessly. He was famous for being genuinely excited when an experiment proved him wrong, because a clear disproof was information, real information about the world, which was always more valuable than a confirmation of what you already believe. He extended this principle beyond science. He believed that the most fundamental form of respect you could show another person was to tell them the truth as clearly as you could. Not unkindly, not brutally, but clearly. Softening truth for the sake of social comfort was a kind of condescension. It said, implicitly, that the other person couldn't handle reality. Feynman thought almost everyone could handle more reality than they were typically given credit for. This made him difficult in committee settings. He had no patience for diplomatic non-answers. He had no ability to pretend that a weak argument was acceptable because an important person had made it. He would say clearly and directly that an argument didn't work. He tried to do this without malice. He usually succeeded, but the clarity itself sometimes felt like aggression to people who had constructed entire professional identities around avoiding that level of directness. It also made him extraordinary in crisis. Part 11. The Challenger investigation. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. 7 crew members died. The entire United States stopped to watch the footage again and again, the white trail against the blue Florida skies suddenly branching into 2 divergent paths. The Rogers Commission was assembled to investigate. Feynman was invited to participate. He was 67 years old at this point and already ill with the kidney cancer that would eventually kill him. He was not, by the standards of Washington politics, an ideal committee member. He didn't do diplomatic. He didn't do vague. He went to Washington. The official investigation process moved with the careful, managed pace of large institutional inquiries. There were briefings. There were presentations. There were enormous stacks of documentation. Feynman sat through it all, but he was also doing his own investigating, independently, talking directly to engineers and workers at NASA rather than relying solely on official presentations. What he found disturbed him profoundly. He learned that NASA had been aware of concerns about the O-rings, the rubber sealing components in the solid rocket boosters, particularly at low temperatures. There had been internal discussions about this. There had been objections from engineers who were worried about cold weather launches. Those objections had been overridden. The Challenger launched on an unusually cold January morning. The O-rings failed. Feynman knew that large bureaucratic systems develop a particular pathology. They begin to make decisions based on schedule pressure, budget considerations, political expectations, rather than on engineering reality. They develop optimistic risk assessments because optimistic risk assessments are organizationally convenient. They find ways to reframe danger as acceptable risk because acceptable risk allows the work to continue. At the public hearing, Feynman did something that has become one of the most famous moments in the history of scientific communication. He had obtained a small piece of O-ring material. He had with him a glass of ice water. During the hearing, while questions were being asked and answered in the usual formal way, he quietly dropped the O-ring material into the ice water. He let it sit for a few minutes. Then he retrieved it and showed it to the people near him. The material had become noticeably less flexible. Then, in his testimony, he noted this demonstration. Rubber loses flexibility at low temperatures. This was not complicated. This did not require advanced physics. This required understanding the basic behavior of materials under cold conditions, which engineers had understood perfectly well. The question was not about physics. The question was about whether the physics was being allowed to determine decisions. He stated his conclusion clearly. There appears to be a disconnect between the management and the working engineers at NASA. Management appeared to have a significantly more optimistic assessment of the reliability of the shuttle than the engineers who worked on it. This discrepancy was not a minor procedural issue. It was the kind of discrepancy that kills people. He wrote an addendum to the official report, which NASA initially tried to exclude. Feynman insisted it be included, or he would remove his name from the report entirely. The addendum was included. In it, he wrote a sentence that has been quoted ever since as a perfect example of scientific communication at its most honest and direct. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Nature cannot be fooled. That sentence is so compact and so complete that it can bear almost infinite examination. You can run your entire scientific practice through it as a filter. You can run your personal life through it. You can run government policy through it. Any system that allows comfortable fictions to override inconvenient realities is a system that has appointed the wrong judge. Nature does not care about your schedule. Nature does not care about your budget. Nature does not care about your career or your organization's reputation or what the press release says. Nature is just true. And if your model of nature diverges from nature, nature wins every time, without exception, without mercy, without malice. That's not a cold statement. That's a clarifying one. Once you really accept it, it becomes liberating. You stop trying to manage reality and start trying to understand it. And understanding it, while harder, is the only approach that actually works. Part 12. The classroom that never ended. One of the things that made Feynman exceptional as a teacher was that he never actually left the position of student. He went back to being a student constantly, deliberately, in fields where he had no expertise, because he thought the experience of not knowing was essential to remember. He described a quality that he called the joy of finding things out, which became the title of one of the collections of his talks and essays, and what he meant by it was specific and unusual. He wasn't just talking about the satisfaction of resolving a question, he was talking about the entire experience of not knowing and then knowing. The texture of confusion followed by clarity. The way a good explanation feels physically different from a poor one, how it settles differently in your mind, how you can feel the understanding clicking into place. He thought this experience was one of the most genuinely available pleasures in human life, and he was baffled by the fact that so many people had been trained, by poor education, to associate it with anxiety rather than delight. This was his central educational mission, more fundamental than teaching any particular fact or theory, to show people that the experience of working through a problem was pleasurable, not painful. That confusion was a normal part of understanding, not evidence of personal inadequacy. That saying, "I don't know," was the beginning of something interesting, not the end of something embarrassing. He used to begin explanations of complex topics by acknowledging his own confusion about related things. Not as performance, not as false modesty, but as genuine demonstration. He would say something like, "I have to be honest with you, I've never been fully satisfied with the way we usually explain this." And then he would work through the problem from the beginning, in front of the audience, showing the actual process of thinking rather than just presenting its polished result. This was radical. Most experts present their expertise as finished product. Here is the answer, delivered with authority. Feynman presented his expertise as ongoing process. Here is how I think about this. Let's see what happens if we approach it this way. The difference between those two modes of presentation is enormous. The finished product model creates audience passivity. You receive the knowledge. The ongoing process model creates audience participation. You think with the expert in real time. And that participation is what produces genuine understanding, as opposed to the simulation of understanding that comes from receiving and memorizing answers. Part 13. The physics of flowers. There's a famous exchange that Feynman described involving a friend who was an artist. The friend said that scientists were incapable of appreciating beauty, that science reduced everything to its mechanisms, stripped it of its mystery, and in doing so, made it less beautiful rather than more. Feynman found this genuinely confusing, not offensively so, confusingly. He couldn't understand why knowing how a flower worked would reduce its beauty. He said, "I can see the flower the same as my friend can. I can appreciate its color, its form, the delicacy of its petals. That enjoyment is available to me. But I can also see things my friend cannot. I can imagine the complex molecular processes happening at the cellular level, the competition and cooperation among different chemical systems, the evolutionary history that produced this exact configuration of color and form to attract specific pollinators. I can see the flower as an object in a vast web of relationships stretching back through geological time. Does that additional knowledge diminish my aesthetic experience? No, it expands it. The beauty operates at multiple scales simultaneously, and I get to experience more of those scales than someone who sees only the surface." He made a similar point about the night sky. Looking at stars with the naked eye, you see light. Looking at them with an understanding of stellar physics, you see nuclear furnaces billions of kilometers away. You see light that has been traveling toward you for longer than our civilization has existed. You see in some cases objects that no longer exist. Ghost light from dead stars. You see a universe so vast and so old that the word large doesn't begin to touch it. Which experience is more beautiful? Feynman's position was the deeper one, every time. Not because the surface was inadequate, but because the surface was a doorway, and understanding was what allowed you to walk through it. He pushed back, gently and persistently, against the idea that science and wonder were in tension. He thought this was one of the most damaging misconceptions about science. Science, properly understood, was not the enemy of mystery. It was the machine that produced mystery. Every question you answered opened 10 more questions. Every level of understanding you reached revealed a deeper level below it. If anything, the more you knew, the stranger and more wonderful the universe appeared. He would often be asked whether science left any room for spiritual experience. And he would say, define spiritual experience. If you mean the experience of standing in the presence of something vastly larger than yourself, and feeling simultaneously your own insignificance and your intimate connection to the whole of it, then physics has given me more of that than anything else I know. If you mean something more specific, you'll need to tell me what you mean. He was not religious in any conventional sense, but he was deeply unwilling to pretend that science left him cold. It didn't. He was moved by physics the way musicians are moved by music, the way poets are moved by language. It was, for him, the great emotional fact of his intellectual life. Part 14. The last lecture by the late 1980s, Feynman was seriously ill. He had been diagnosed with 2 rare forms of cancer, kidney cancer and a cancer of the blood-producing cells. He had undergone surgeries. The prognosis was not good, and he knew it. He continued to work. He continued to teach. He gave a final lecture to his Caltech students with something like his full energy, or close enough that most of them didn't fully register that he was dying. He held himself to his own standard until the end. The last public lecture he gave was in 1987. He chose as his topic the question of computers and what they could and couldn't do, a subject that fascinated him in his final years. He was characteristically thoughtful and original in his approach, treating the question not as a technical problem but as a philosophical one. What is computation really? What is it about physical systems that allows them to perform logical operations? He was already thinking about what would later be called quantum computing, though the field wouldn't fully emerge for years after his death. He required dialysis in his final months. His kidneys were failing. He was in considerable pain. He could have withdrawn and nobody would have blamed him. He did not withdraw. He stayed engaged, stayed curious, stayed present. His final words, as recorded by those who were with him, were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." There is something very specific about that sentence, not brave in a theatrical way, not sentimental, not philosophical in a grand sense, just himself. Until the end. The irreverence was not a mask for fear. It was his actual relationship with existence, including its ending. He had thought about death, carefully and honestly. He had concluded that he didn't know what happened, that nobody knew, that the evidence available suggested simply an ending. He had made his peace with that conclusion because making peace with what you actually know, rather than comforting yourself with what you'd like to believe, was how he lived. He died on February 15th, 1988. He was 69 years old. Part 15. What he left behind. The physics he left behind is extraordinary by any measure. His work on quantum electrodynamics is among the most precise theories ever constructed, predicting the behavior of electrons with an accuracy that has been described as equivalent to measuring the distance from Los Angeles to New York to within the width of a human hair. His path-integral formulation of quantum mechanics opened entire new branches of theoretical physics. The Feynman diagrams he invented are used daily by physicists around the world. But here's what strikes me. Thinking about all of this, the equations exist, yes. The Nobel Prize exists. The textbooks exist. But what people remember when they remember Feynman is not the equations. What they remember is a quality, a way of being in the world, a relationship to curiosity that felt, when you encountered it, like a permission to not know, a permission to be confused, a permission to find things beautiful without fully understanding them, while also working hard to understand them better. A permission to be completely yourself in the presence of the biggest questions. He was not a saint. He was not always kind. He could be arrogant in ways he didn't always acknowledge. His relationships with women were complicated and not always to his credit. He could be dismissive of ideas he found boring. He was human, with all the specificity and limitation that implies. But he had this one quality that was very nearly perfect. He was completely unwilling to pretend. Not about physics, not about himself, not about what he knew or didn't know or felt or didn't feel. In a world where so much of professional life is performance, where so many experts have learned to perform expertise rather than enact it, Feynman enacted it, all the way down. Think about Arlene's letter, sealed for 43 years, not mailed because he didn't know her new address. That's not a man who was afraid of his emotions. That's a man who felt them so completely that he couldn't reduce them to anything smaller than they were. He couldn't manage them into something appropriately sized. He just felt them and kept the letter. Think about the wobbling plate. The moment that restarted his creative life wasn't a grand intellectual challenge. It was a cafeteria plate spinning through the air. And he looked at it, and something in him said, "Interesting." And he could not follow it. He couldn't choose to find it uninteresting. Curiosity wasn't something he did. It was something he was. Think about nature cannot be fooled. Sitting in that commission meeting, watching the managed presentation of a preventable disaster, knowing that the people who had died partly because institutional processes had been allowed to override engineering reality, and refusing to let that conclusion remain unsaid, regardless of what it cost organizationally, regardless of who it offended. These are not three separate stories about a physicist. They are the same story. They are the story of a person who refused, in every domain of his life, to place comfort above truth. Part 16. The Permission We Inherit. Richard Feynman has been dead for almost 40 years. The world has changed almost beyond recognition in that time. The physics has advanced enormously. The institutions have shifted. The culture of science looks different. And yet, his books sell hundreds of thousands of copies every year to people who were not born when he died. His lectures, converted to video from the original recordings, are watched by students around the world. His voice, that particular New York accent with its rhythmic emphasis and its habit of suddenly going quiet just before the most important point, is as familiar to a certain kind of curious person as the voice of a beloved teacher. Why? I think it's because he gave something that is very hard to find. He gave the experience of watching someone who was genuinely, completely, unperformatively engaged with the world. No gap between the person and the performance. No management of impression. Just him. Fully, messily, brilliantly, joyfully him. We are surrounded by content. We are surrounded by people presenting versions of themselves carefully calibrated for effect. We are very, very good at detecting miscalibration, even when we can't articulate what we're detecting. We feel it, and we find it, at some level, exhausting. Feynman was not exhausting, he was energizing, because he was real. He showed you that the most interesting person in any room was the person who was most genuinely themselves, not the person performing the most impressive version of themselves, not the person who had cultivated the most refined presentation, the person who actually showed up, with all of their curiosity and all of their ignorance and all of their willingness to say, "I don't know," and then work furiously to find out. He showed you that genius was not a wall between you and the material. It was a door into it. He showed you that physics was not separate from life. It was an extension of the same impulse that makes you want to understand the expression on a friend's face, or the mechanism of your car engine, or the relationship between one piece of music and another. The desire to understand is one thing. He had a lot of it. But the desire itself is universal. And that plate in the cafeteria, that wobbling plate, I keep coming back to it because there's something in it that seems to contain everything. He could have ignored it. Any reasonable person would have ignored it. It was a plate spinning through the air. It was nothing. It was lunch. But he looked at it and thought, interesting. And then he thought harder. And then the hardest thinking of his career began with that moment and led to a Nobel Prize. You know what that means? It means the wobbling plate was not nothing. It was a door. And he knew how to see doors. What are you walking past right now that might be a door? What question have you dismissed as too small or too simple or too strange to be worth following? What curiosity have you talked yourself out of because it didn't seem serious enough? Feynman's whole life was an argument against that self-editing. It was an argument for taking the curious impulse seriously, every time. Not because every curious impulse leads to a Nobel Prize. Most of them don't lead anywhere except somewhere else interesting, which is enough. More than enough. He once said, "I was born not knowing and have had only a little time to change that, and I will die not knowing." This from the man who knew more about the quantum behavior of matter than almost anyone who had ever lived. He died not knowing. He knew that clearly. And he wasn't distressed by it. He was energized by it. Because not knowing is not a deficiency. Not knowing is the condition that makes curiosity possible. And curiosity is the condition that makes everything else possible. The physics. The bongo drums. The letters to our line. The O-ring in the ice water. The wobbling plate. The Tuvan stamps. The Mayan codices. The drawings sold under a pseudonym. All of it flows from the same source. The source that says, look, pay attention. This is interesting. Find out why. That's the inheritance he left. Not just the equations. Not just the diagrams. The permission. The living, breathing, completely irrevocable permission to be genuinely curious about the world, all the way to the end, without apology and without diminishment. Richard Feynman was born in Queens and died in Los Angeles, and spent the time in between being more completely himself than almost anyone manages to be. And the world, the real world, the world of physics and particles and electrons and quantum fields, turned out to be exactly as strange and beautiful and extraordinary as his curiosity demanded it to be, which tells you something important about curiosity. It is not just pleasant, it is not just useful. It is, in some deep sense, accurate. The world rewards it. Not always immediately, not always directly, not always immediately, and not always in the ways you expect. But the world rewards it. He knew that. And he lived accordingly. And somewhere, in whatever direction you turn your attention next, there is a wobbling plate. There is something ordinary, that is, if you look at it long enough and hard enough and with sufficient openness, extraordinary. He would tell you to look. So look.